Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. We are continuing our mini-series about cycles of seven and the secrets of Shabbat. Where we left off last class, we started going through the experience of Shabbat. First, we discussed the preparations for Shabbat on Friday. And then we went through candle lighting, Kabbalah Shabbat, returning to the home, Shalom Aleichem, Kiddush, the meal. And that's as far as we got last week. This week we are continuing, starting with the day of Shabbat. There'll be some reference to the first meal in the beginning as well, but we're starting at the day of Shabbat. As we've discussed, the Arizal gave symbolic names to each of the meals of Shabbat and also the parts of Shabbat, the evening, the day, and then third meal, afternoon, as Shabbos ebbs away time. As we said, the symbolic name for the night of Shabbat is Chakal Tapuchin Kadishim, the field of holy apple trees. And that is a symbolic language for Malchut, for the sphere of Malchut, which is the seventh of the lower sphirot and represents Shabbat in general. And Malchut represents the feminine. And we learned in depth about the feminine aspect of Shabbat. And it also relates to the Garden of Eden, this idea of the holy apple fields. The day of Shabbat is called Atika Kadisha, the ancient holy one. And this brings us to an understanding of four archetypal Shabbats in history. The first one is Shabbat Bereshit, where Shabbat is first mentioned. And that is, of course, in the conclusion of the 6 days of creation, is followed by the seventh day, Shabbat. So that's called Shabbat Bereshit. And in Kiddush, in sanctifying the day, Friday night, we say, Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit, that Shabbat is a remembrance of the acts of creation. So that is what's called the first archetypal Shabbat, Shabbat Bereshit. And that's very, very connected to the night of Shabbat. Okay, I was just informed by my wife that a very good friend of ours, some of you know, Shalom Schwartz, who lives on the Moshav. Apparently it's his father's yurtzeit tonight. And so we will dedicate the learning to Mordechai ben Shalom Halevi. This is Shalom Schwartz's father, of blessed memory. Mordechai ben Shalom Halevi should have an aliyah to neshama, and our learning should help in that process. So we had the first archetypal Shabbat, which is connected to the night of Shabbat. Also, the night of Shabbat is the Shabbat called Yetziat Mitzrayim. Because in Kiddush we say, Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit, remembrance for the days of creation. But we also say, Zecher L'Yetziat Mitzrayim, a remembrance for coming out of Egypt. So what's the connection between Shabbat and coming out of Egypt? So when we came out of Egypt, even before we came to Mount Sinai and received the Torah, we already were receiving some of the laws of Shabbat. And that you could see in Parshat Beshalach, when we got the laws of the manna, the food from heaven. And we're told that Rashi tells us that already Moshe was giving over some of the laws of Shabbat. But on a deeper mystical level, coming out of the 6 days of the work week of creation and going into Shabbat is like a Yetziat Mitzrayim, because the physical, mundane, material world, as beautiful as it is, a lot of times is very limiting, has lots of obstacles, trials, tribulations. And so when we go into Shabbat, it's like a Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's like coming out of Egypt into freedom. So that's the second archetypal. The third, and this is how we get to the day of Shabbat, is that there's a midrash that when the people had an experience of the revelation of God at Mount Sinai, not that God is what I'm about to describe, but it's very symbolic, but the people experienced God as the Ancient of Days, the Holy Ancient One. And he appeared like an old man of great wisdom. This is what the Midrash tells us. Of course, it's very anthropomorphic, it's very symbolic. And then we're told that at the splitting of the sea, God appeared like a young warrior. Now, again, we're talking in the language of human beings. We don't take this literally, but the Midrash was just connecting the receiving of the Torah at Sinai with this image of the ancient Holy One. And that is the name that the Arizal gave to the whole day of Shabbat. And this connects us to the third archetypal Shabbat, is because according to all of the sages, we receive the Torah on Shabbat. So there's a deep connection between receiving the Torah on Shabbat and the whole experience of Torah. So the Arizal gave the day the name Atika Kadisha for all of these reasons. And here, because this third archetypal Shabbat is connected to the receiving of the Torah, therefore, Kriyat Torah, the one major public reading of the Torah, is on Shabbat. Now, we also read the Torah on Monday and Thursday, and as we'll see shortly at Mincha, the afternoon prayer of Shabbat, but those are only the first aliyah, the first of 7 sections of reading the Parsha. Only on Shabbat day do we read the entire portion. So this is connected to this idea that the Torah was given on Shabbat. And that is the third archetypal Shabbat, the Shabbat of the giving of the Torah. And the fourth one is connected to the third meal, and that is Yom Shekulo Shabbat. Every time we say grace after meals, Birchat Hamazon on Shabbat, we pray, we mention the idea of in the future, the existence and human consciousness will experience reality as Yom Shekulo Shabbat, a day that is all Shabbat, a whole different level of existence altogether. After Mashiach comes, the world to come, a day that is all Shabbat. And that becomes the fourth archetypal Shabbat in history. So just to review, we had Shabbat Bereshit, the Shabbat of creation, the Shabbat of leaving Egypt, the Shabbat of receiving the Torah, and in the future, Latid Lavo, the experience of Yom Shekulo Shabbat. So returning now to the day of Shabbat. So we mentioned that the unique element of the day is the public reading of the whole Torah portion. And this becomes obviously a very important focal point for a community, that we read the Torah publicly every week. And this becomes the centerpiece of the morning davening. I already mentioned that during the week, when we say the Amida, the standing prayer, we have 18 and now 19 blessings. 3 in the beginning of acknowledgement, 3 at the end of praise, and 13 requests in the middle. But on Shabbat, to connect to the number 7, we have the 3 in the beginning and the 3 in the end, but only 1 in the middle. Only 1. And so all of the prayers of Shabbat, there are 4 prayers. There's the evening prayer, the morning prayer, the additional prayer, Musaf, and the afternoon prayer. But all of them have only 7 blessings. So one element of the morning prayers is in the Amida. So we say the following words. After the 3 beginning blessings of acknowledgement, we say, Yismach Moshe b'matanat chelko, that Moshe is joyous in the gift of his portion. Ki eved ne'eman karata lo, because we're talking to God, of course, because you have called Moshe a faithful servant. Klil tiferet birosho netatalo, a crown of beauty you have given him upon his head. Ba'amdo lefanecha har Sinai, when he stood before you on Har Sinai, u'shnei luchot avanim harid biyado, and the 2 tablets of law he came down with his hand. So there is a tradition of like, what is this talking about? What is this? Moshe is very happy here. So there is an idea that at Har Sinai, Moshe, and really all of Israel, through Moshe, received 1,000 lights. This represents the incredibly intense and strong revelation of God at Sinai. The idea that 1,000 lights were shining. Now, this is significant because the word for 1,000 is Elef, and the same root, the same 3 letters, is the letter Aleph. Now, Aleph means 1. Its numerical value is 1, but its meaning is 1,000. And so this represents all of reality, that behind the plurality, the largest number mentioned in the Torah is actually 1,000. You can have 10,000 or scores of thousands or scores of 10,000s. But in the Torah, there is no millions or billions or trillions or zillions or quadrillions. You go up to 1,000 and then you have increments of thousands. And yet behind all of that plurality, of course, is the oneness of God. And so the idea that Moshe and Israel received 1,000 lights at the giving of the Torah, but behind that was the revelation of the oneness of God. But we're told that when Moshe broke the tablets, the 1,000 lights just disappeared. They left the consciousness that we can reach. But the idea is, so why is Moshe so happy? What's the gift of his portion? We're told every Shabbat, Moshe, and through Moshe, we can experience those 1,000 lights again. And that's the mystical explanation of Yismach Moshe b'matanat chelko. That Moshe is very happy in the gift of his portion. His portion is these 1,000 lights. And as we've learned before, the Alter Rebbe said that every person has a point of Moshe in them. Moshe was what's called a neshama klalit, an all-inclusive soul. All of our souls were included and connected in the deepest way to Moshe. So when Moshe lost 1,000 lights, we all lost 1,000 lights. But when he gets them back, we also are able to connect to them again. So this is just a beautiful idea of the energy of the day of Shabbat. The day of the Shabbat is very connected to the Torah and the experience of receiving the Torah, these 1,000 lights. Excuse me a second. Okay, so now let's go to the second meal of Shabbat. We already learned this idea of having 3 meals in Shabbat. We learned the source of the 3 meals. And the second meal, also the Arizal called the meal of Atika Kadisha, the meal of the ancient Holy One. And now I'm going to mention something that will connect all 3 meals, is the idea of Zmirot. We haven't really talked about the songs that we sing at the meals of Shabbat. And so we're going to start with the idea that the Arizal, who never wrote anything, in other words, all of the teachings from the Arizal were later written down by his main student, Rabbi Chaim Vital, and really Rabbi Chaim Vital's son, Shmuel. And 20 years after the Arizal passed away, only then did the teachings of the Arizal come out. But he did write 3 mystical poems that are sung at the 3 meals of Shabbat. And just very, very quickly, there's a beautiful allusion to it, because in all 3 of them, the acronym of his name appears in the beginning of each of the stanzas. It spells out Ani Yitzhak Luria. One of them, the last 2 letters aren't there. One of them actually has Ani Yitzhak Luria Ben. But this is a very common expression of poetry and song in Jewish tradition, where the person writing the song would write it according to their name. In other words, the song was an expression of who they were. And so the Arizal wrote these 3 mystical poems, and interesting enough, they're all in Aramaic. They're not in Hebrew, they're in Aramaic. And this is very, very connected to what could be considered the main source of the wisdom of the Arizal, was his delving into the depths of the Zohar. That this was his main inspirational text, and he invested 20 years of understanding every word of the Zohar. And so many of his teachings are coming from the Zohar. Many of them were not explicit in the Zohar. It took someone like the Arizal to be able to reveal the very allegorical, symbolic language of the Zohar. So his 3 poems are in Aramaic, like the Zohar. The Zohar is written in Aramaic. And I'll just mention that the first poem is called Azamer B'Shvachim. I will sing with praises. And this actually begins with the word Azamer. And we call all of the songs that we sing in Shabbat at the meal Zmirot, from the word Zemer, which is music, song. Now, I translated it in one way. Azamer b'shvachim. I will give praise with song. Others point out, and it actually makes very sense when you look at the content of especially the first and the third, that the root zemer, zayin mem resh, is the same root as to prune, lezamer, lizmor. And of course, in that word I just said, lizmor is connected to mizmor. And so many of the Psalms begin with Mizmor LeDavid, as we're going to see shortly. A song to David. So some interpret the words Azamer B'Shvachim as I will cut off with praises. Meaning I will cut off any negativity left over from the week with singing and praises. And that actually makes a lot of sense. We don't have the time to go through every word of these songs, but when you go through them, there's many, many mentions of this idea of cutting away negativity, cutting away the klipot, the shells surrounding holiness. And especially in the third meal, the song of the third meal is there's a lot of emphasis on this idea that anything that's holy is going to have an opposite force trying to prevent its revelation. If anyone has been following, and I hope all of you are, Living in the Times, the series. So that is the theme of, I think it was even, no, it will be Thursday. I believe the theme of the Thursday one will be this idea of the greater the holiness, the greater the opposition. And so the Arizal is actually alluding to that, that the holiness of Shabbat, there has to be a concerted effort to break through the shells of material reality, of any negativity left over from the week. So again, the name of the song sung on Friday night from the Arizal is Zamer B'Shvachim. The one for the day is called Asader L'Sudata. I will prepare the feast of the day of Shabbat. And I should just mention that many, many different nigunim have been written to these poems of the Arizal. And many, many people, I should mention, as part of Kiddush, will include these poems from the Arizal, meaning as an introduction to Kiddush at night and the day, they include these songs. Other people make Kiddush, and then during the meal, we'll sing these songs. Different customs for different people. And while I'm at it, I'll just mention that the name of the third poem of the Arizal for the third meal is B'nei Hechala Dichsifim, the children of the palaces of desire. We'll get to that when we get to third meal. But here, I just want to mention the whole idea of Zmirot on Shabbat. It's a very, very important part of the meals of Shabbat. Maybe some people do sing during the week at their meals, but not many people. Not many people. So singing, especially with one's family and friends around the table, and sometimes big Shabbatonim, singing these songs become just a very, very joyous part of Shabbat. And there was one of the Hasidic Rebbes. So he said, unfortunately, I don't have a good voice. But if I did, I would sing the whole Shabbos. I would just sing everything. Everything would be singing. So singing here, we bring it into the home. Now, hopefully, we're part of communities that bring song into the prayer itself, into the morning prayer in Kabbalah Shabbat. There should be. But as we mentioned, as part of the series, one of the beautiful things of Shabbat is our home becomes like the temple, like the tabernacle. And each of the elements that we discussed represents one of the elements in the temple. The table becomes the altar. The lighting of the candles becomes the menorah. The flowers become the incense. Kiddush, the wine becomes the wine libation. The breads become the 12 showbreads. But one thing that we didn't mention, and we'll mention now, is that in the temple, one of the most important experiences was the singing that was happening in the temple. Is that when people came to the temple and there was this heavenly, angelic singing by the Levites with instruments and song and harmony, it was a spiritual, mystical experience. We all know the power of music. So since we're turning our homes into a temple, so by singing at the table, at the meals of Shabbat, is bringing the singing of the temple into our homes. So it's a very, very important part of the Shabbat experience. And I just want to mention, I had the privilege to be with Reb Shlomo off and on for 20 years in Shabbat. And everyone knows Reb Shlomo was the kindest, the most giving, the most laid back, the most mellow person, but he would get upset at certain times. And the two times that he would get visibly upset and let everyone know was when he was davening and he was pouring his whole heart into it, and he didn't feel like everyone else was doing the same. He would stop the davening and he would turn around and he'd say, "What's going on here? Chevra, this is Shabbos." But he would say it in like really a powerful way. And then he would continue davening, and obviously everyone got the picture. But the other time was, we used to, on the Moshav, people used to come from all over the country to have Shabbat with Reb Shlomo. And we would make these big meals and have just lots of people. So when it would come to Zmirot, so he would start singing one of the Zmirot, and a lot of people joined him, but a lot of people just continued with their conversations, right? And there was kind of like noise in the room. He would like, whoa, he would get very upset. And he'd say, Chevra, how can you talk during Zmirot? How can you think of talking during Zmirot? Would you talk during davening? Do you know how holy the Zmirot are? And then a lot of times he would say, obviously, not everyone understands how holy the Zmirot. So I'm going to teach you. And he would take whatever one of the Zmirot we were learning, and he would start teaching line by line what it really means. So, but I'll never forget, because when he would get upset, like, whoa, whoa. So anyways, Zmirot are very important for Shabbat, very important. Okay, now let's go to Mincha. Oh, no, not yet. So what happens after second meal? Okay, in the summer, there's many hours. So many communities have classes. I teach a class every Shabbat. In the summer, I do it the hour before Mincha. But in the winter, when the days are very short, we do it in the morning before davening, 7:30 in the morning. Because after lunch, there's hardly any time. But what there always should be time for, Shabbat Menucha. Have a Shabbos nap. And one of the acronyms for Shabbat, Shin Bet Tav, is Shena B'Shabbat Ta'anug. The Shin is Shena, meaning sleep. B'Shabbat, Bet, on Shabbat, Ta'anug is a pleasure. And for many people, this is, including myself, this is an intrinsic part of Shabbat, is a Shabbat nap. Now, since we've been talking about the Arizal himself advised everyone to take a Shabbos nap, and he himself took a Shabbos nap. So I want to tell you quickly 2 Shabbat nap stories about the Arizal. So these are classic stories. So one is, it was time for a Shabbos nap, and the Arizal told one of his students who was at his house, please wake me up at a certain time. I think it was like either a half an hour or an hour later. That was his nap. And the Arizal fell asleep, and the student is watching the Arizal, and he sees his lips moving. The whole time he's asleep, his lips are moving. So he's wondering, is he even asleep? He didn't understand what was happening. So when the time came to wake him up, he was almost afraid to, because to him it was just so awesome. He was like, he didn't know what level of reality he was. But if the Ari asked you to wake him up at a certain time, you wake him up. So he woke him up, and he said, Rebbe, can I ask you a question? Do you realize that your lips were moving while you were sleeping? And the Arizal said, yes. And he said, can I ask why they were moving? Like what was happening? And so he said, when I sleep, my soul goes up to the yeshivot shel mala, the study halls in heaven, and I am learning with the great sages of the past. So the student was like, whoa. So he said, can you tell me what you just learned? Maybe the Arizal was actually teaching all of them, but like what was happening? And there are two versions of this story. Each one is more incredible than the other one. The Arizal said, and we have to understand the Arizal was an incredibly humble person. So when he said the following, maybe if someone else said it, we would think that it was somehow boastful. But the Arizal said, if I had 8 years, it would not be enough to tell you what I just learned in the last hour. The other version is, if I had 80 years, it would not be enough to tell you what I just learned in the last hour. So, halavai, halavai, our souls could go to that place. The second story is about the Arizal and Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo lived in Sfat at the same time as the Arizal. He was the composer, the compiler of the Shulchan Aruch, the main halakhic source to our day, the Shulchan Aruch. And he was double the age of the Arizal. And it's a whole long story. He desperately wanted to learn from the Arizal. And the Arizal convinced him that his Kabbalah was not meant for Yosef Karo. Yosef Karo was a great Kabbalist in his own right. Many people don't know this. He wrote many Kabbalistic books that exist. We know him more as a legalist, but he was a tremendous mystic, tremendous Kabbalist. So the story is like this, that the Yosef Karo took a Shabbos nap, and when he got up, he realized it was late and he had to get to shul. And after shul of Mincha, he would host a third meal for all the people in the shul in a certain place that only he had the key to. When he got up from his nap, he's looking for the keys. He can't find the keys. And it's getting later and later, and he realized, I don't know what to do, but I have to get to Mincha. Everyone's waiting for me. So he goes to Mincha, and the Arizal is there, and they're davening the Amida. Everyone finishes, and Yosef Karo keeps on davening and davening and davening, and he has a very worried look on his face. And no one really understands, and they don't want to start the repetition of the Mida until Rabbi Yosef Karo finishes. That's just the way things are done. And so after quite a while, the Arizal walks up to the Yosef Karo and whispers something in his ear. No one can hear. And a big smile comes on Yosef Karo's face. He finishes the davening, and then he tells everyone to come for Shalashudas, and he runs home, and he finds his keys, and he goes and he opens up for everyone, and they have third meal. And so at third meal, he says, I'm sure everyone's wondering what happened during the davening today. So he said, when I took my Shabbat nap, I forgot where I put the keys for third meal. And so that's why I got lost in my davening. I was so worried and trying to figure out where did I put my keys. And I want to tell you, he said this, he said, we have no idea who we have in our midst. He said the Arizal came up to me and whispered in my ear, why would the Rebbe be so worried about the keys that he put under his pillow when he took his Shabbos nap? And then he knew where his keys were, so he could finish his davening. So those are two Shabbos nap stories. But it really is true. Sheina b'Shabbat tanug. Sleeping on Shabbat is a pleasure. Okay, now we're at Mincha of Shabbat. And Mincha of Shabbat, very, very special Amida. I mean, they're all special. But this one begins, Ata echad, v'shimcha echad, umi ka'amcha Yisrael, goy echad ba'aretz. You are one. We're talking to God. You are one, and your name is one. And who is like your people, one nation in the earth? That's how the middle of the Amida begins. Now, the reason this is important, because there is a discussion in the Talmud, a kind of way out discussion, where it's proposed that God wears tefillin. Just like we wear tefillin, God wears tefillin. Now, obviously, again, we're talking symbolic language. We don't imagine that God has a head. We don't imagine that God puts on physical tefillin. But there's a concept. There's a concept of God wearing tefillin. So the sages ask, well, what is written in God's tefillin? And so they answer, what's written in our tefillin is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So what is written in God's? Ata Echad, V'shimcha Echad, Umi Ka'amcha Yisrael Goyecha Ba'aretz. You are one, and your name is one, and who is like your people, one nation in the earth? So in other words, we're wearing or celebrating God's oneness, acknowledging God's oneness. And in God's tefillin, he's acknowledging the oneness of Am Yisrael. It's a very beautiful Talmudic passage. But that is Mincha. That's how the middle part of Mincha begins. And also in that part, we have Avraham Yagel, Yitzchak Yiranein, Yaakov Ubanav, Yanuchu Vo. Avraham was joyous, meaning with the Shabbat. Yitzchak was full of song and joy. And Yaakov and his sons rested in it. And this is one of the ideas brought in the concept that the patriarchs and matriarchs were keeping the Torah even before it was given. So this is one of the places where it's actually mentioned, because it's talking about Shabbat. That Avram, Yitzhak, Yaakov, and family, they were all doing Shabbat. Whether it was exactly the way we do it now, that's not the point. The point is they had a concept of Shabbat and they were keeping it. Okay, we've learned this before, so I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. It was part of our series already, but since this is the time to mention it, the third meal of Shabbat is called Ravin de Ravin. In fact, the whole afternoon of Shabbat is called Will of Wills. Ravin de Ravin. Ravin is Aramaic. Will of Wills. Ratzon of Ratzon. Question is, why does it have this name? Is because we imagine before there was a creation, that God was, so to speak, in a state of perpetual Shabbat, infinite, peaceful, blissful, unified light of Shabbat. And then God creates the world. Well, the world begins, Yom Rishon begins Motzi Shabbos. That begins the first day of the week. And so it's explained that Mincha time of Shabbat is reconnecting to a time before creation, when the thought of creating the world arose in God's mind. The will of wills, when the will of God was aroused to create what we call the universe, the world, existence. And so I've mentioned this before, but I'll say it again. Reb Shlomo used to say, Friday night is high energy. Third meal is deep energy. And so the singing, the Zmirot of third meal is a completely different tone, a completely different energy than the whole rest of Shabbat. It's, in fact, for those who were here when we heard Mizmor LeDavid, that's the kind of energy, this slow, deep, heartfelt, even bordering on melancholy type of singing, because Shabbat is about to leave. It's about to end. And so that's the energy. Now the Arizal, the name that he gave to the third meal is Zer Anpin, the small countenance. Zer Anpin. And the song that he composed is B'nai Hechala Diksifin, the children of the palace of longing. And the words to this song, the theme that runs through the song, is that Shabbat is about to end. And he uses the imagery of thoughts of the week are starting to creep in. And he called them chutzpahdik dogs, like biting at the heel. And like the theme of the song is Shabbos is not over yet. Don't let those thoughts start biting at your heel. And in fact, this is the highest point of Shabbat. And that's why he called it the children of the palaces of longing. So there's an idea that in the physical material world, when someone has a desire, someone has a taiva, has a desire for something, when they get it, they're at least temporarily satisfied. If someone is hungry, or just has a taiva for that chocolate cake on the table and just cannot take their eyes off of it, and it just, I really want that chocolate cake. So when they have it, sometimes they'll go for a second piece, but at a certain point, they're satisfied. Now, 2 hours later, they're going to be hungry again, and they're going to have a new desire. But at the moment, that desire is fulfilled. And this works with desire in general for physicality. And everyone can use their imagination for other metaphors for what we're talking about. But with holiness, it doesn't work like that. The more holiness that we experience, the more holiness we want. It does not satisfy us. The more we get, the more we want. And that is the feeling of third meal, because we know that Shabbat is about to end. And yet, like, we've just experienced a whole day of holiness and spirituality and God's light and a 60th of the world to come. So we're, in a way, we're not ready to go back to the week. We want to hold on to it. So that's the underlying theme of B'nai Hechala Diksifim. Many people also have the custom to sing Mizmor LeDavid. That's why I played the song in the beginning. Mizmor LeDavid is the 23rd Psalm. For many, many people, it's their favorite psalm. For many people who are not that connected to different Jewish traditions, who don't know about the Psalms so much, but almost everyone knows, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Almost everyone knows that psalm. And in fact, the Arizal suggested that before Kiddush, at the night and the day, that also Mizmor LeDavid is recited. And many people do that. So at third meal, the Hasidic tradition is to sing it 3 times, not just once, 3 times. And that is very much because it's third meal. So we sing it 3 times. We also know that the idea of doing something 3 times is called a chazaka. And like when we finish one of the 5 books of the Chumash, one of the 5 books of Moses, so everyone says, chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. Be strong, and be strengthened. And we say it 3 times, chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. So third meal, we're about to go out of Shabbos. We need a lot of chizuk. The week is coming. And everyone needs strengthening. So we sing Mizmor LeDavid 3 times. One of the secrets of Mizmor LeDavid is it has 227 letters, which is gematria bracha, blessing. So this psalm is potent blessing. And we've learned that Shabbos is the culmination of the previous week. So it's called Yom HaShvi'i, the 7th day. It's a culmination of the week, but it's also the blessing of the coming week. And third meal is like the bridge. It's the bridge between the Shabbat, that is the culmination of the previous week, and all of the blessing for the coming week. And also, it's 57 words, which is gematria zan. Zan means to provide, to sustain. And we have this word in the first blessing of Birkat Hamazon, grace after meals. Hazan et hakol. He provides for everyone. And so again, this psalm represents all of the sustenance for the coming week is coming from Shabbat. So what it's telling us is, if we want to have a successful week, bring the energy of Shabbat into the week. And this is a very important teaching from the Arizal, from the Baal Shem Tov, that there's one way of looking at Shabbat, like we look at time as a circle. So let's say we start Shabbat here, and we reach a real high point, and at the end of Shabbat, we go into another week. There's a reality to that, but he said that's not the best metaphor, because it appears like after this high point of Shabbat, we just end up where we started. So he said it's better to look at Shabbat as a spiral, that we start down here, but we end up here, And that means the new week starts up here and not down here. And so this idea of Mizmor David is bringing the sustenance and bringing the blessing into the week. 57 words, Zan, sustenance, 227 letters, bracha, blessing. Many people also sing Yedid Nefesh, just like we sing it at the beginning of Shabbat. Here we are making closure. Third meal is a closure, but it's a closure that leaves us up here and not where we started from. Okay, I'm going to go just a little bit farther. And so we're going to finish this segment. That after third meal, we daven the evening prayer, then we do Havdalah. So we'll end this segment with a little bit about Havdalah. Havdalah literally means separation. And it's the ritual that the sages developed in order to make the transition from Shabbat to the week. And there's really four major symbols. Is we make a blessing over wine. We make a blessing over something sweet smelling, or not sweet, but a good smell. We make a blessing over fire. And then we make a blessing over the idea of separating from Kodesh L'chol, from holy time to mundane time, and a number of different separations. And so this is a ritual from the rabbis. It's a very symbolic, just like we see, and a lot of it is it's closure. We begin Shabbat, we make Kiddush over wine. So we end Shabbat by making a blessing over wine. We begin Shabbat with lighting candles. So we end Shabbat with lighting candles. Especially Sfardim, even before Kiddush, will make a bracha on something good smelling. And here we also have something good smelling. And just like we sanctify the day of Shabbat with Kiddush, here we're recognizing the specialness of Shabbat by making a separation between holy time and mundane time. That's why the fourth archetypal Shabbat in history is Yom Shekulo Shabbat, where physical and spiritual will be united. All time will be holy. All experience will be holy. Everything will be a consciousness of Shabbat. And as mentioned in the Zohar, tzaddikim are called Shabbat because even in the week, someone who is on an elevated level of consciousness can be in a Shabbos consciousness. It's not the day of Shabbat. We're not quite at a day that is all Shabbat, but it's already available to have Shabbat consciousness even during the week. There's much more to be said about Havdalah, but I think this would be a good place to stop. So we've now gone through from preparing for Shabbat on Friday, Kabbalah Shabbat, Friday evening, Shabbos day, third meal, and then the separation back into the week. I will take just 2 more minutes. That it's very traditional to sing a song for Eliyahu Navi right after making Havdalah. And one of the explanations is that there's actually a tradition that Mashiach will not come on Shabbat. It'll be too much ruckus. That Mashiach will only come after Shabbat. So right after Shabbat, we have a tradition that before Mashiach comes, Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, will return to announce the coming of Mashiach. So the first thing we do after Havdalah in the new week is we sing for Eliyahu Hanavi, like, now Mashiach can come. Come quickly, come quickly. And I once heard Reb Shlomo say is like the reason that in the world Saturday night is like, the big night, the wild night, the high energy night, is because there is the energy that now Mashiach can come. Now Mashiach can come. The way that the world experiences Saturday night is not exactly how we're going to greet the Mashiach. But he said on an energy level that's why Saturday night has the energy that it does. It's because now Mashiach can come. Okay, so we'll end there. We're not done with Shabbat yet. We have another class or two. There's actually a lot more to learn. And Bezrat Hashem, that our experience of Shabbat should get higher and deeper all the time.